The fire truck slowed at the first concrete bump, its heavy suspension dipping violently while 3 children playing nearby froze. Sensing something was wrong before anyone spoke a word. It wasn't an emergency call that morning, just a routine equipment check. But what happened next exposed a mistake so serious it would unravel an entire HOA leadership. By the second bump, the driver reduced speed to a crawl, jaw tightening, realizing instantly these obstacles weren't standard, weren't approved, and definitely weren't safe for emergency response vehicles. When the truck stopped completely before the third bump, the fire captain stepped out, scanning the road, then turned sharply and asked the question that changed everything. "Who authorized these?" he demanded, voice calm but edged with disbelief, already knowing the answer wouldn't be simple, and that someone had crossed a line they didn't understand. "My name is Zach Morrow. I am 59 years old, and I spent over 2 decades designing public road systems where mistakes like this didn't just cost money, they cost lives. I had moved to Knoxville expecting quiet retirement, not legal battles over infrastructure, safety compliance, and the consequences of someone confusing authority with actual expertise. Our road, Heron Crest Lane, wasn't owned by the HOA, not even partially. But that was a detail the new president had either ignored or never bothered to check. 11 property owners, including me, shared legal ownership through a recorded maintenance agreement, a document so clear it left absolutely no room for interpretation or creative authority. That agreement had governed the road peacefully for decades, until a man named Derek Poole decided safety improvements were more important than ownership laws and regulatory compliance. Derek was energetic, confident, and dangerously impulsive. The kind of person who believed good intentions could replace due diligence, especially when no one challenged him immediately. His first projects had seemed harmless landscaping upgrades, lighting improvements, but none had undergone professional review, and none had faced consequences significant enough to stop him. The speed bumps were different, because this time he interfered with infrastructure that emergency services depended on. And that mistake carried weight far beyond neighborhood aesthetics or comfort. I hadn't been home when they were installed, which is why my first encounter was unexpected, my truck lurching violently as it struck the first bump under dim headlights. I stopped immediately, stepping out into the quiet night, staring at a structure that was clearly overbuilt, improperly designed, and completely unauthorized by any governing standard. The bump stood 4 inches high with aggressive edges, profile that would slow any vehicle, but more importantly, could damage emergency apparatus trying to respond quickly. I drove slowly over the remaining 5 bumps, each one confirming my suspicion that this wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure of judgment, with serious consequences. That night, I called other road owners, and the response was unanimous. No one had been informed, no one had consented, and everyone was already dealing with damage or near accidents. Gloria Tate, who had lived there nearly 2 decades, was furious, describing how her car nearly bottomed out, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. The road maintenance agreement required approval from at least 9 owners for any modification, yet here we were, 11 out of 11 rejecting something already built. That alone was enough for legal action, but my experience told me there was something even more serious hidden beneath the surface of this decision. So I checked county records, confirming what I expected: no permits had been issued, no applications filed, and no official oversight had ever been requested. Then I checked fire district documentation, and that's when the situation escalated from a property dispute to a public safety violation. Heron Crest Lane was officially listed as an emergency access route, meaning any modification required fire marshal approval before construction could begin. Derek hadn't just ignored property rights. He had interfered with emergency infrastructure, something no municipality treats lightly once discovered. The next morning, I met the fire marshal on site, along with a deputy who measured every bump with precision instruments far beyond my own. They documented height, angle, spacing, everything that proved these structures violated safety standards for emergency response vehicles operating under real-world conditions. Then the fire engine returned, this time performing a live navigation test, and the results were immediate and deeply concerning. The truck slowed at the first bump, hesitated at the second, and stopped entirely before attempting the third, unwilling to risk mechanical damage. The operator stepped out and said plainly he would never attempt those bumps during an actual emergency, not at any speed that mattered. The fire marshal wrote his findings carefully, stating the bumps created a direct impediment to emergency response, a phrase that carries legal and regulatory weight. Holding that report, I felt something shift. The issue was no longer about inconvenience or legality. It was about lives potentially at risk. That afternoon, I contacted an attorney, someone experienced in property and municipal law, because this situation required more than complaints or negotiations. Within days, legal action was filed, including injunctions, damage claims, and a demand for immediate removal of all unauthorized structures from the road. The court responded quickly, granting an order that forced the HOA to remove every bump and restore the road to its original condition. At that point, most people would have thought the situation was resolved, but that assumption would prove completely wrong. Because during the legal discovery process, something unexpected surfaced within the HOA's financial records tied directly to the project. Payments to the contractor were normal until they weren't, revealing a transfer that didn't belong in any legitimate infrastructure project. A portion of the money had been redirected to a private company, one with a name that matched Derek Poole's personal business registration. It wasn't just negligence anymore, it was financial misconduct layered on top of a dangerous decision affecting public safety. The contractor had paid Derek back, a clear kickback, hidden inside what was supposed to be a community improvement project. That single discovery changed the entire case, transforming it from civil litigation into a criminal investigation almost overnight. The attorney didn't hesitate, forwarding everything to state authorities, who opened an investigation with immediate priority due to the clear paper trail. Auditors began reviewing Derek's previous decisions, uncovering a pattern of similar transactions across multiple HOA-funded projects. Each one followed the same structure: approval, payment, and a quiet return of funds through his private business entity. What looked like isolated poor judgment became a systematic abuse of position, using community funds for personal gain. The total amount wasn't massive by corporate standards, but it didn't need to be. The clarity of evidence was enough. Derek hired a defense attorney quickly, but by then, the narrative had already shifted beyond control or explanation. The HOA board suspended him, attempting to distance themselves from the situation, though the damage to their credibility had already begun. Meanwhile, the road was restored, inspected, and cleared by the fire marshal, ensuring emergency vehicles could pass without obstruction once again. The difference was immediate. Engine 7 navigated the road smoothly, proving how dangerous the previous modifications had truly been. Residents felt relief, but also frustration, knowing the situation had been entirely preventable with even minimal due diligence. The civil case concluded with a significant settlement covering damages, repairs, legal fees, and compensation for affected homeowners. More importantly, a formal record was filed permanently, confirming the HOA had no authority over that road or any future modifications. That document ensured the same mistake could never legally happen again, regardless of who held leadership positions. Months later, the criminal case reached its conclusion, and Derek entered a guilty plea under state law. The charges included misuse of fiduciary position and commercial bribery, both tied directly to the speed bump project and related contracts. The courtroom was quiet as the plea was read, a moment that marked the final collapse of a man's authority. He received probation, restitution orders, and a permanent ban from holding any HOA leadership position within the state. His house was sold shortly afterward, and he left the community he had once tried to control through misguided decisions. A new board took over, led by individuals who understood the importance of boundaries, documentation, and respecting legal frameworks. They issued formal apologies, not just as words, but supported by actions designed to rebuild trust with affected property owners. Policies were updated, oversight increased, and every future project required proper review before approval or execution. The community slowly returned to normal, though the memory of what happened remained a quiet reminder of what could go wrong. I often think back to that first night standing in the headlights, realizing something was wrong before fully understanding its implications. That moment of quiet observation was the beginning of a chain reaction no one in the HOA had anticipated. It wasn't just about the bumps, it was about accountability, about systems designed to protect people being ignored entirely. The fire truck's inability to pass became the turning point, the undeniable proof that something had gone dangerously wrong. Without that test, the issue might have remained buried under paperwork and assumptions for much longer. Sometimes it takes a real-world failure to expose what documentation alone cannot fully convey. And sometimes that failure arrives just in time to prevent something far worse from happening later. The children playing that morning never knew how close they were to witnessing something much more serious. To them, it was just a fire truck, stopping unexpectedly. Nothing more. Nothing that required concern. But for those of us who understood, it was a clear warning, one that demanded immediate and decisive action. Infrastructure isn't just concrete and asphalt, it's trust, safety, and responsibility built into physical form. When someone alters it carelessly, they aren't just changing a road, they're changing the outcome of future emergencies. That's what Derek never understood, and by the time he did, it was far too late to undo the consequences. The law stepped in where common sense had failed, restoring order where authority had been misused. It's a pattern I've seen before in my career, though rarely this close to home or this personally involved. People assume small decisions carry small consequences, but infrastructure doesn't work that way. Every change has ripple effects, especially when it intersects with emergency response systems. That's why regulations exist, not to slow progress, but to prevent irreversible mistakes. The speed bumps are gone now, the road smooth again, the system functioning exactly as it was designed. But the lesson remains, embedded in the memory of everyone who witnessed how quickly things escalated. Authority without understanding is dangerous, especially when it operates without accountability or oversight. Derek's story became an example, one shared quietly among residents, and more formally in legal documentation. It serves as a warning to anyone who believes intention alone is enough to justify action. Because in infrastructure, intention doesn't matter, results do, and those results can be measured in seconds during emergencies. Seconds that determine whether help arrives in time or too late to make a difference. That's the reality behind every road, every access point, every decision made without proper consideration. And that's why this story matters beyond one neighborhood or one HOA board. It's about understanding the systems we rely on and respecting the boundaries that keep them functioning. Because once those boundaries are crossed, the consequences don't stay contained, they spread. Sometimes into courtrooms, sometimes into lives, and sometimes into moments that can never be undone. So tell me this: if that fire truck had been responding to your home that day, would those bumps have changed the outcome?